Confused 20th century history. Now, this is an oral examination about 20th century history. What do you know about Mao in China?
Oh, Charlemagne Mao started the Chinese culinary revolution. A little red book of Chinese cooking tips was so popular, people waved it in the air and sang, "Long live Charlemagne Mao."
What happened in Cuba in the late 1950s and early 1960s?
This bloke Fidel Castro started the Castro Oil Company in Cuba. It caused a lot of trouble when he asked his friend Nicky in Russia to send him some big rockets. I think he wanted Cuba to be first on the moon. The Americans didn't like this as they wanted to be first. The Yanks got very cross with Russia, so they didn't send the rockets in the end and tried to get to the moon first themselves. The Americans beat them to it, but the Russian man Gagarin got in space first in a big Sputnik. Lady Gaga named herself after him. Oh, by the way, there's now a lovely holiday camp on Cuba run by the Americans. Instead of red coats or blue coats, they wear orange suits. I think the holiday camp's called Geronimo Bay or something. All holidays there are long stay, so I've heard.
Who was the first man on the moon and what was his nationality?
The American Louis Armstrong. He couldn't play his trumpet there because he was wearing a spacesuit, so he just sang "What a Wonderful World," but actually it wasn't wonderful at all, but very boring, just a load of dust and rocks. So he got fed up and got back in the spaceship with his friend Buzzer and came back to Earth. A few others went afterwards but said there's not even a McDonald's there, so they never went back to the moon again. Americans won't go anywhere where there's no McDonald's.
Who was Karl Marx?
Oh, he was in films with some of his brothers. One smoked a cigar and another never smoked but pumped a car horn instead. Karl Marx also wrote a book about capital cities. It was just called Capital.
Who was Lenin?
Lenin was one of the Beatles. There are lots of statues of him in Russia, but they don't look anything like him. I don't think they ever met him or saw his picture. Lenin wrote songs with McCarthy, who used to go witch hunting in America in the early 1950s.
Who climbed to the top of Everest first?
Oh, there was this bloke called Hillary, called that because he liked climbing big hills. So he climbed one with this bloke Sing Sing in Africa or somewhere, and the Queen was ever so pleased because it was just before they stuck that big metal hat on her head with all the jewels and things in it. Hillary placed a big Union Jack flag on top of that big hill because he came from one of the countries the Queen ruled.
What was the Berlin Wall?
Oh, it was a big wall what Hitler built around Berlin near the end of the Second World War to stop the city being invaded. He hid in a bungalow with his girlfriend Eva, and they thought he shot her then himself, but I think they escaped.
What do you know about the Falklands War?
Well, when Hitler and Eva escaped from Berlin by digging a tunnel under the Berlin Wall, they went to Argentina, and she changed her name to Evita and ruled the country. I saw a musical about her. She was a good singer, but she got fed up with that, so she and Hitler invaded the Falklands. That made Mrs. Thatch, our Prime Minister, very cross, so she went over there herself with some Royal Navy ships to sort them out.
What is the British Commonwealth?
It's what the Queen called other rich people who she feels are very common. A lot of them live abroad in what was the Empire. I think she sent them there, so they named the old empire the Commonwealth.
What do you know about the two major conflicts of the 20th century?
Well, World War I was all fought on Brighton Pier. I know because I saw the film. But World War II was all over the place, wasn't it? The Americans stayed out of it until the Vietnamese bombed Ruby Harbour. Then the Yanks joined in and the Vietnam War started. It's sometimes called the Korean War because North Korea also joined in.
The final question is about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. What do you know about that?
It was also known as the Peasants' Revolt, wasn't it? They were very angry, but this woman, Marie Antoinette, gave them cake to eat, and then they took over Russia, and much later they nationalised the Suez Canal in Egypt. Britain was so cross that same year we invaded Hungary. Or was that Russia? I can't remember. Someone invaded Hungary anyway. Sorry, I think I got most of the questions right, didn't I?
Not quite, I'm afraid. You have a very mixed-up idea of recent history, don't you?
Well, it was all before I was born, wasn't it? I don't like history because it's mostly about dead people or old ones like you and the Queen. You've got to be woke and know what's going on now, innit? Black Lives Matter, so I'm going to go and pull down some of your old statues. You can stuff your old history.